All right, so we're going to go ahead and transition to Gail with Using Clean Water Act to Protect Our Way of Life. Are you with us? There you are. Welcome.
Well, hello everyone. I'm so honored to be here in order to have this opportunity to talk about the Clean Water Act. I've been sitting on for the last couple days and really enjoying the speakers and the films. What an amazing program that you all put on here. What I am hoping to talk about with you for the next little bit is the intersection of the Clean Water Act and the ways that you all the interests you all have in protecting the sacred waters in and around the lands that have supported Native Americans historically and currently, and how the Clean Water Act can actually help do that, and the framework, maybe some ideas about how that might work. Who I am. I'm a longtime resident of Oregon. I consider myself a Clean Water Act translator, or a whisperer, if you will. I'm not an attorney, but I pretend I play one on TV sometimes, I say. I try to be the go-between between the regulatory world and what people really need sometimes in terms of information. I analyze the regulations and the law and the ways that it happens to be put into place in both states and tribes. I've been a trainer and a guide to how to use it for a long time. I've had the opportunity, the honor to work for many years with tribes, most notably with New Mexico Pueblos, and in the 2000s, I worked with the Yukon Intertribal Watershed Council and the Cook Inlet Keeper to put on some trainings up in Alaska related to the Clean Water Act, and folks came from all over the state to try to talk about how we could use the Clean Water Act better. So it really is, my focus really is on improving the implementation of how this law, that's almost in 2022 will be 50 years old, and our activities and our work with it has to grow up as well with it. My plan for the next little bit is to talk about some options about protecting tribal values and unique uses of the water through the Clean Water Act, some of the specific legal and regulatory tools that are available to tribes, and leave you with some resources, because we won't have a lot of time to dig in, sometimes spending days on any one of these topics. I want to start with a couple stories, a couple examples of tribal use of Clean Water Act. One that I go to a lot is the Isleto Pueblo on the Rio Grande in New Mexico, downstream of Albuquerque, when they were one of the early tribes to take advantage of developing water quality standards once the opportunity was set up in this official setting. And in doing so, they set a very, very stringent arsenic standard, and upstream Albuquerque and their discharge was discharging levels that were considered unhealthy for the uses that the Pueblo paid attention to and needed the water for. Farming and religious ceremonies, to name two. And the Pueblo was able to take their water quality standards through the court system and have that downstream much more highly protective standard protected and put into play. And the Supreme Court, the city tried to take it to the Supreme Court and they refused. So at that point it was given a success, turned into a success for the Pueblo. And so thinking about ways that standards can play into the activities in and around the waters that you care about is one way to think about it. Another example that I wanted to raise is the Mole Lake Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. When they developed their water quality standards, they're in the area that is known as Wisconsin. They assigned or designated all of their waters as outstanding national resource waters. In doing that, they were protecting the ecological and recreational significance of these waters. That's the highest protection in the Clean Water Act for waters. And they did that to prevent, what that designation does is it prevents new and additional pollution upstream. And in their case, they were trying to prevent upstream mining activities from putting more pollution in their waters. So those examples are just to kick us off with a little bit of motivation for what we can do with this tool in the requirements that exist. So the law itself, I like to start with the main objective of the law: to restore and maintain the physical, chemical, and integrity of the nation's waters. Well, I'd like to throw in there, not even casually, but intentionally, tribal waters as well, because they are not necessarily U.S. waters. That's not the way we should think about them. And because the tribes are given this authority and this opportunity to use the Clean Water Act, I would vote for a change to that overall objective. But the intention here is to think about restoration and maintenance as both dueling important ideals, and that the chemical, physical, and biological integrity is what we're trying to get at here. I want to briefly go over a few of the official paths that are in play for tribal standards, for tribal involvement with the Clean Water Act, and then talk about an unofficial path as well that also can perhaps work for some of you. And many of these you may have experience with, you may have been frustrated by. These procedures and these buckets are by no means perfect, but they're out there, and we hope to help people understand them a little bit better. So government-to-government consultation, I'll go into all of these in a minute, but just to summarize, government-to-government consultation ahead of agency decisions or actions that might affect tribes is one avenue. Some ways that EPA gets involved in approving certain processes that the tribes will put in play that we'll talk about, and participation actually in the federal and state public involvement opportunities that exist through all the water programs and all the EPA programs for that matter is always an avenue, and oftentimes a more powerful one when tribes are involved than when a resident who isn't a tribal member. The unofficial path I want to make note of and get back to later is the idea that within your traditional knowledge and your historical connections across the generations, there's a lot of discussion, if not writing down, of internal values and beliefs and uses that I want to argue for the case for what those internal standards and values can really play into in these official paths and maybe some unofficial paths. So with that, I'm going to move on to a little bit of digging in here. On consultation, again, not a perfect process, but it's set up, and the Region 10 guidance calls for meaningful communication prior to actions and implementing decisions. Stories of way too many invitations to consult come down all the time, and sometimes it doesn't feel very meaningful, but yet this is in place. There's an executive order in place from right before President Clinton left office that pulls out a lot of different elements to that intention for consultation with tribes and self-government, honoring the tribal trust resources and other rights, supporting tribal sovereignty and self-determination, looking for ways that affording Indian tribal governments the maximum administrative authority that they can have, and undertaking the policies to be thinking about ways that tribes can develop their own policies, achieve their own program objectives, and deferring to tribes is really things that I wanted to call out in that those documents for consultation. Again, it's more than that. I'm sure the invitations come more than most tribes are able to participate, but when it does happen, it feels that there's a framework here for intentional attention to what matters to the tribes. With respect to EPA approval processes, there's two parts, and this came up a little bit earlier when the director of the Indian Environmental Office was talking, and he's mentioned the similar treatment as states, or the acronym is used as TAS, and many of you may have heard of this. This ties back to the Clean Water Act, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which actually have language specifically calling out tribal involvement, tribes in Alaska Native villages, how they would be involved in these processes that are set up in all the programs within the acts. We're focusing on the Clean Water Act, but here the requirements talk about federal recognition, governing body, carrying out duties, appropriate authority, which has changed in some things that I'll mention in a minute, and being capable of carrying out the functions of the program. So those are what are considered the basic requirements that, for this treatment. In 2014, there was a repeal of an Alaska exemption to the regulation that sets up this treatment, and there was a memo that went through a lot of channels that set up that exemption. And in its repeal, it allows for Alaska Native villages and other trust lands to be potentially included in this process. That open door was echoed also in 2016, where there was a revision to the interpretation of how the Clean Water Act interplayed with this tribal authority, potential setup for tribal authority, and allowing tribes more easily to go through this treatment, similar treatment as state process. We know that, as I mentioned with the consultation, that tribes are not states, and they are, there has been reference to this should be more treatment as sovereign, but it is a process that it sets up the following slide, which allows, again, through EPA approval, the tribes can take on program responsibilities in several areas of the Clean Water Act. Water quality standards, which is, and we'll talk, I'll bring up some details about all of these in just one moment, but water quality standards, the measurement of water quality and determining impairments of water, developing plans for problems, setting up the permits when they're for pollution discharge, looking at the setting up the programs for what they call dredge and fill, which is really about dealing with waters that when you're digging up the soil, pollution is going back into the waters. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also the water quality certification of federal permits and licenses, which allows states and tribes to apply standards that they've developed to federal licenses and permits to make sure they aren't violating them when they are giving people and entities right to do certain things. So to dig in a little bit on each one of those, oh, not quite yet. The other piece that is a more official process is this idea of participating in all of those programs that I just mentioned, They all have all the federal and state entities have public involvement requirements. The Clean Water Act also, in the early pages of it, requires for public involvement in all of these programs. And so, again, not a perfect process, but be that as it may, there are things such as the triennial review of water quality standards that are supposed to be every so often, but at least every 3 years, not happening usually. At the state levels, they often don't get it done every 3 years. The listing of impaired waters is waters that have the problems and need attention, happens every 2 years. Drafting of permits happens all the time. And all of these things, including the other one listed here, those water quality certifications of federal permits and licenses, they happen they happen all the time. And these processes for involving the public are available to tribes and their involvement can be very powerful in those. So going through some of these elements of the Clean Water Act that either tribes could take authority for or participate in, where the neighboring lands are setting them up. The water quality standards are 3 parts. They're uses that you want and have set goals for in your waters. They're setting up the criteria for protecting those uses, and they're setting up a program that protects the best of the waters. And that's not necessarily the best quality, it's the waters that have the most ecological and recreational significance. That's the part of the Clean Water Act that the Mole Band of the Chippewa used in trying to hold back mining impacts. The uses is an important piece to point out. It's not just, while the uses are a list that's designated, they don't have to be happening right now. They can be goals that you believe should happen in your waters, or they could be existing uses that are happening but might not be in that list of uses. The standards are a powerful tool. The assessment and restoration piece program that, again, tribes can either take over or participate in involves identifying, using those standards to say, hey, which waters aren't making the cut? Which waters are impaired, and what are we going to do about it? This is a rule that was kind of finalized not too long ago, but the intention was there all along to have tribes be able to take over this part of the program. If you've got standards, then you should be able to set up the process for assessing whether or not you're meeting those standards. The discharge permit process, otherwise you may have heard it as the NPDES process, an acronym of many that are out there. It stands for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. In the Clean Water Act, it was set up that the discharges would be eliminated by the mid-'80s. Unfortunately, we certainly haven't done that, but we're still sticking with it. And it's only through participation in these processes that we can try to get closer to elimination and not have these permits be just about institutionalizing pollution. And those are many categories of wastewater, stormwater, including construction sites and industrial sites, concentrated animal feeding operations, a fancy word for feedlots where too many animals are confined together, and mining operations. Those all may have discharge permits that either the tribes could take over issuing or be very much participating in when they are issued. The dredge and fill permit program is a funny name. People call it the wetland program sometimes, but it really is far more than just about wetlands. But it's when some entity is going to be digging in areas that will discharge, it will end up dumping some water or, some soil or pollution with the soil back into the water bodies. So anytime our wetlands are being dug up, riparian areas, if you're doing a stream crossing or building a road along a water body or dams, those are all times when this permit process comes into play. And then finally, getting back to when you are looking at these the opportunity to certify the water quality for a federal license and a permit, the tribes could take over this opportunity if they have their standards to apply to when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission comes in and tries to license a dam. And is that dam going to meet downstream standards in a state or a tribal area? In those dredge and fill permits I was just talking about for disturbing wetlands or building a bridge or or building along a water body, are the water quality standards in place going to be protected while those permits are issued? And grazing permits fit in there as well. So this water quality certification is considered a privilege, and it has to be exercised to be used. I want to leave from the opportunity of those official processes, both taking them over, consultation, or taking over programs, or participating in the public opportunities to give input to them. There's also this idea that we know that for whether it's a spoken word or written word over generations, you have talked about the values and the demonstrated uses in and among your people, and those demonstrated uses, for example, ceremonial and cultural uses, are seldom included in water quality standards that we see at the states. Not never. There are places when they've been included, and the articulated values and demonstrated uses can be put into play and used during consultation or public involvement, even if they haven't been officially put through the chain of approval, if you will. However, there's different ways that those, depending upon where you are and what entity you're trying to influence, there will be different reactions to that, but it's a very powerful tool to use even if they haven't been approved, if you will, by EPA and anointed in that sense. But with all those different ways, I want to just recognize that this is a lot to take in a short period of time, and trying to understand how we can go through this process and use either the consultation or the treatment similar to state, or taking over, once approved of treatment similar to state, taking over a water quality program, or articulating internal values and using it through those other processes. These are many different ways the tribes can be involved and intersect with the Clean Water Act. There's a lot to digest in that. The EPA has so many amazing pages of not only tools but information on all these areas. I'm going to put a few of them in the chat when I'm off here, but I wanted to call out a few of them. They actually have a template for treatment similar to state. They have a template for water quality standards. There's actually a long list of the tribes that have gone through the treatment is similar to state process in Region 10 and across the country, and whether or not they have the water quality standards. And you can click on them, and you can actually look at on several of them, look at whether or not those standards are included and what they look like. So you can get ideas about whether or not that would work for your approach to protecting the sacred waters. And also there's a whole area that talks about which programs tribes can take over and give some guidance on that. I also want to do a shout out. My decades of work on this, on the Clean Water Act and kind of being this translator, if you will, has been mostly with an organization, national organization called River Network. And with them, I helped to put together an owner's manual on the Clean Water Act that's somewhat out of date, but still has a lot of interesting and helpful, easy to read ways to understand the Act. I'll also put that in the chat when we're done. So I'm, near my end of time. I don't know if there are any questions that have come up. I'd be happy to answer them if Nita's on.
Hi, Gail. This is Mak Mantur, one of the program coordinators. We did have a few questions in the chat. One of them is from Rick E. And Rick asks, can you comment on tribes setting their own fish consumption rates and the standards and what implications that has?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Rick. It's within all the standards, whether a tribe sets them or EPA sets them at the federal level or states set them, there are assumptions. And assumptions, in particular, Rick's mention of tribal consumption levels of fish have come up for many, many years as an important area that is inadequately set at the state and federal level because there's assumptions far below what tribal levels of consumption are. And so there's always these ways of saying this particular pollutant is going to go in, the health concerns about this pollutant has to do with how much someone might eat or how much they're going to be exposed to if it's in the air or in the water. If they're swimming, it's bacteria. So when you're not adequately recognizing a higher level of consumption, then the standards themselves, the amount that is allowed to be perhaps discharged into the water bodies or the pollution that's allowed to go in is too much. So all these things tie together and very fundamental understanding needs to come from the tribes into these processes, these public involvement processes that say, wait a second, your assumptions about that pollutant in those fish means that I'm only eating a third of what I really eat or even a tenth of what I really eat. And when taken into account the levels that are set up as protective have to be far more stringent. And unfortunately, there's all these different pieces into the black box of developing standards sometimes have to be taken apart. And the voices of Native Americans in these conversations are so critical because of the lack of awareness sometimes of how the ceremonial uses will expose folks to waters that might not be high enough quality. How much is the ceremonial uses of fish and the importance of that that protective standard that they be healthy, be protected. So thank you for that, Rick. It really it dives into the details of the components that go into not just how we use the waters, but what the number is that protects those uses that is oftentimes not taking into account the full picture. I wonder if there's any other questions.
Thank you so much, Gail. We appreciate you taking the time and sharing with us today. And